There is a text message sent at 11:47 on a Tuesday night. It reads, "I need to see you. Tonight? Don't tell anyone." The sender is not a classmate. The sender is not a friend. The sender is the teacher. The student never responds. And by the following morning, investigators will be trying to understand why. Jordan Calloway was 17 years old when the school year began. By most accounts, and there were many people interviewed who gave them, Jordan was the kind of student who existed just outside the spotlight. Not invisible, not troubled. Somewhere between those two things, which is perhaps the space most teenagers occupy without anyone paying close attention. Jordan had transferred into Harwick High School at the start of junior year, relocating from a town about 90 miles east following a family restructuring, parents divorcing, a younger sibling in tow, a move meant to start over. The kind of background that teachers are briefed on in general terms, if they're briefed at all. Jordan lived with a mother who worked double shifts at a regional logistics company, which meant that most evenings were spent alone in a two-bedroom apartment on the eastern edge of town. There was a grandmother who called on Sundays. A small group of friends still forming. An interest in music, specifically in the kind of analog, layered composition that most teenagers don't develop a taste for until their mid-20s, which tells you something about the interiority Jordan carried around. By all accounts, Jordan was doing reasonably well, not thriving, but getting there. And then Jordan was assigned to the advanced literature class taught by Marcus Hale. Marcus Hale was 34 years old. He had been teaching at Harwick for 6 years. Before that, he had completed a graduate degree in comparative literature and spent 2 years adjuncting at a community college while working on what he described to colleagues as a novel, a project that, by the time of these events, appears to have been quietly abandoned. He was considered a good teacher. Multiple former students mentioned his class in college application essays. He had a reputation for making students feel understood, which, depending on how you think about that, is either a gift or a warning. He was not married. He lived alone. He coached the school's literary magazine and often stayed late. Nobody thought anything of it. The timeline, as reconstructed by investigators, begins in October of the school year, roughly 6 weeks after Jordan had entered Hale's class. What changed in October is subtle, and that subtlety is part of what makes this case difficult to discuss cleanly. There was no single identifiable moment. There was a pattern, and patterns are only visible in retrospect. Jordan began staying after class. Initially, this appeared academic. Hale had assigned an ambitious independent reading project, and Jordan, according to Hale's own testimony, had ambitious ideas about it. The after-school sessions were, at first, described by both parties as tutorials. Jordan's mother, when interviewed later, remembered her child mentioning a teacher who actually gets it. She did not remember feeling alarmed. She was tired. She was working 2 jobs. She trusted the school. By November, the after-school sessions had shifted from the classroom to Hale's office, a small room near the back of the English wing that had a window facing the parking lot and a door that, records would later confirm, had no interior observation panel. This is relevant. By December, phone records would show that Hale and Jordan were in contact outside of school hours. The messages began professionally. They became personal. And then, they became something else. Something that, when investigators finally read through the full thread, prompted one detective to describe the exchange as a slow erosion. That phrase stayed with me. It is important to be precise here about what is being described. Jordan was a minor. Hale was an adult in a position of direct authority. Whatever language either party used to characterize what was happening, the law is unambiguous, and the psychological literature on these dynamics is consistent. The capacity for genuine consent does not exist when the power differential is this significant. This is not a gray area. What makes this case psychologically complex is not whether a crime occurred. It is why, and how, and at what point Hale convinced himself, if he ever truly believed it, that what he was doing was something other than what it was. In January, Jordan began withdrawing. Friends noticed. One friend, interviewed by police, said Jordan seemed like someone being pulled in a direction they hadn't chosen. That is a remarkable thing for a 17-year-old to say about another 17-year-old. It suggests she understood something, even if she lacked the framework to name it. Jordan's grades, notably, did not fall. In Hale's class, they improved. Investigators would later flag this as part of a documented pattern, a way of binding a student to a relationship through academic recognition, creating a feedback loop where the relationship and the reward become difficult to separate. In February, Jordan told Hale it needed to stop. The exact content of that conversation is known only through what both parties describe separately, and their accounts diverge significantly. What is agreed upon is that Hale did not accept it cleanly. What followed over the next 3 weeks was a period of escalating contact messages that ranged from pleading to controlling, with the volatility that investigators would later characterize as consistent with someone experiencing the loss of something they had never legitimately possessed. On a Wednesday night in late February, Jordan did not come home. Jordan's mother called the school the following morning. She called Jordan's friends. She called the grandmother. By noon, she had filed a report. By evening, Harwick was in the news. Marcus Hale was interviewed that first night. He said he had not seen Jordan since the previous school day. He appeared composed. He expressed concern. He offered to help in any way he could. He was lying. To understand what happened, you have to understand who Marcus Hale believed himself to be. Because very few people who commit serious harm believe, at the time, that they are the villain of the story they're living in. Colleagues described Hale as intellectually confident, socially reserved, and this word came up repeatedly: intense. He had a way of making the person he was speaking with feel like the most interesting person in the room. Former students spoke about this warmly. It is the same quality, applied differently, that former colleagues would later describe as unsettling. What investigators pieced together, partly through the message thread and partly through testimony, was a specific psychological architecture. Hale had identified in Jordan something he framed to himself and, gradually, to Jordan as exceptional. A rare mind. An old soul. Someone who didn't belong in their circumstances. This framing is not unique to this case. It appears in the literature on predatory grooming with notable consistency. The elevation of the target. The suggestion that the relationship exists outside ordinary rules, because both parties are outside ordinary categories. It manufactures intimacy through flattery and then leverages that intimacy to create obligation. Jordan, who had recently been uprooted, whose home life was strained, whose sense of self was still forming, was, in retrospect, someone for whom that kind of recognition carried particular weight. This is not a criticism of Jordan. It is an observation about how these dynamics work, and why they work most effectively on people who are already carrying something heavy. What complicates the psychological portrait is that Hale, by most accounts, did not present as someone obviously dangerous. There were no prior formal complaints. There were, however, retrospective ones: former students who, after the story broke, described interactions that they had not, at the time, known how to categorize. The line between an inspiring teacher and an inappropriate one can be thin. It becomes visible only when you know where to look. What seems to have shifted in February when Jordan withdrew is that Hale's self-conception was threatened. He had built, in his own mind, a narrative in which this relationship was unique, meaningful, mutual. Jordan's decision to end it did not fit that narrative. And when reality contradicts a story someone has deeply invested in, the response is rarely graceful. The messages from that 3-week period are marked by a quality that forensic psychologists sometimes call reframing under pressure, an attempt to re-narrate events so that the person withdrawing is the one causing harm. You're abandoning something real. You're making a mistake. You don't understand what this is. What Hale never seemed to fully process, or perhaps never allowed himself to process, is that it was never his to define. The investigation moved quickly, once it moved at all, but there were delays in the first 48 hours that would later be scrutinized. The initial missing persons report was filed as a standard juvenile runaway classification that, given Jordan's age and the absence of any prior such behavior, was contested almost immediately by the family. This is a documented issue in missing persons cases involving teenagers, and this case became, in some jurisdictions, a reference point in discussions about reclassification protocols. When investigators pulled Jordan's phone records on the second day, the picture changed. The volume of messages from Hale's number in the preceding 3 weeks was, in the words of the lead detective, immediately significant. What followed was a rapid reassessment of the case, and consequently, of Marcus Hale. Hale was brought back in for a second interview on day 3. He arrived with an attorney this time. He was calm. He acknowledged knowing Jordan well. He acknowledged the messages. He described the relationship as a mentorship that had, he said, become emotionally complex, framing that investigators noted was carefully constructed to acknowledge facts while avoiding legal characterization. What he did not know at that point was that investigators had already located a witness. A custodial staff member at Harwich, someone who worked evening shifts, had, without initially understanding the significance, mentioned to a colleague that they had seen Hale's car in the school parking lot on the Wednesday night Jordan disappeared. The colleague had mentioned it to a police officer at a community briefing. The officer had logged it. The lead detective had connected it. When presented with this, Hale's attorney requested a recess. The interview did not resume that day. Meanwhile, forensic analysis of Hale's phone had surfaced something he had apparently believed was deleted. A final message exchange sent between 10 o'clock and 11:52 p.m. On the Wednesday in question, Jordan had come to the school. What had been described as a voluntary meeting in Jordan's messages read, in context, as a response to sustained pressure, the culmination of 3 weeks of contact that had grown increasingly urgent. Jordan had, it appears, agreed to meet one final time, likely in an attempt to achieve closure that the prior weeks of messaging had made impossible. What happened inside that building on that Wednesday night took investigators several more days to fully reconstruct. The building's internal camera system had a known gap in coverage in the English wing, something the district had flagged in a facilities report 6 months prior and had not yet addressed. This is the kind of detail that, in retrospect, feels almost too convenient to be coincidence. Whether it was as one of several questions the investigation attempted, with incomplete success, to answer. Jordan's body was found 4 days after the disappearance, in a wooded area approximately 11 miles from the school. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma. The location had been accessed via a secondary road that appeared on older regional maps, but not on standard navigation applications. The kind of knowledge that suggested familiarity rather than accident. The case against Marcus Hale was built largely on digital evidence, forensic trace evidence recovered from his vehicle, and the testimony of the custodial witness. He maintained his account a mentorship that had grown complicated, a final meeting, a parting for several weeks of legal proceedings. His attorney argued that the relationship, while inappropriate, was not criminal in the way the prosecution characterized it, and that the evidence linking Hale to Jordan's death was circumstantial. The turning point came not through a confession, but through a contradiction. Hale had stated consistently that he and Jordan had parted at the school on the Wednesday night, and that Jordan had left on foot toward the main road. Cell tower data, combined with forensic analysis of soil samples recovered from Hale's car, placed his vehicle in the vicinity of the wooded area where Jordan's body was found, and placed it there within the estimated time window of Jordan's death. This was not something that could be reconciled with his account. His attorney filed for a continuance. It was granted. 3 days later, in a proceeding that was notably quiet given the public intensity of the case, Hale entered a plea. He did not allocute in detail. He said he was sorry. He said the relationship had never been what people believed it was. He said he had not intended for things to end the way they did. Investigators, speaking afterward, noted that even in the moment of legal acknowledgement, Hale's language continued to orbit the same gravitational center it always had, himself. Marcus Hale was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Jordan Calloway's mother gave a statement at sentencing that lasted less than 2 minutes. She did not describe her grief in detail. She said her child had trusted an adult who had been given that trust by an institution, by a community, by a system that assumes teachers protect students. She said she wanted people to understand that Jordan was not a story. Jordan was a person who liked a specific kind of music and called the grandmother on Sundays and was, in her words, just starting to figure things out. That statement has stayed with me longer than any piece of evidence in this case. There is a particular kind of harm that comes from institutional relationships, the kind where one person holds formal authority and the other holds formal vulnerability. We extend trust to those positions because the alternative, a world without that trust, is one in which learning cannot happen, mentorship cannot happen, growth cannot happen. The position of teacher requires access to the interior lives of young people. It requires the ability to see what they are becoming. That access is a privilege. And in the hands of someone like Marcus Hale, it became a mechanism. What is most disturbing about this case is not its extremity. It is its incremental logic. Each step Hale took was, from a certain vantage point, legible as something other than what it was. Staying late, offering guidance, sending messages, making a student feel seen. None of those things are inherently wrong. That is precisely the problem. The warning signs in this case are not the kind that announce themselves. They are the kind that require a certain framework to read an understanding of power, of grooming dynamics, of the specific vulnerability that comes with being young and displaced and uncertain. Schools increasingly train staff in these frameworks, and Harwick has, since this case, revised its policies on after-hours student contact and communication outside official channels. Whether those revisions are sufficient is a question that people who work in those systems continue to debate. Jordan Calloway was 17 years old. That is not a detail at the beginning of a story. That is the thing the story should not allow you to forget. Cases like this one ask us to reckon with the distance between how something appears and what it actually is. Hale appeared, to most people who knew him, to be exactly what a teacher should be: engaged, thoughtful, invested in his students. The appearance was not entirely fabricated, which is the most unsettling part. The harm was not delivered by a stranger. It was delivered by someone who had been invited into Jordan's life by the very structures meant to protect it. I don't have a clean resolution to offer you. I don't think this kind of story has one. What I can say is this: the people closest to Jordan, the friend who noticed the pull in the wrong direction, the mother who filed the report within hours, the grandmother who called every Sunday, were paying attention. They were not enough to stop what happened, but they were the only reason the truth came out at all. Sometimes that is what bearing witness means. Not preventing, refusing to look away. If you're someone you know is experiencing an inappropriate relationship with a person in a position of authority, RAIN's National Sexual Assault Hotline is available at 1-800-656-4673, and the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline is available at 1-800-422-4453. Both lines are confidential.